Lviv is an ancient city that has stood for centuries at the crossroads of civilizations and empires. In the early 20th century, this cultural and commercial center of Galicia became an arena of fierce confrontation, where the interests of three powerful forces clashed: Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Poland. The city, founded in the 13th century by the Galician prince Daniel of Galicia-Volhynia, had by this time already experienced many historical transformations, passing from hand to hand and absorbing the cultural influences of various peoples. For Austria-Hungary, Lviv was the eastern outpost of the empire and the jewel in the Habsburg crown. For Russia, it was a cherished goal and a symbol of the return of ancient Russian lands. For Poles, it was an integral part of their historical homeland and a symbol of national revival. These conflicting aspirations created an explosive mixture that was inevitably destined to detonate with the outbreak of hostilities. On the eve of the military events, Lviv was a true pearl of Galicia. This city, the third largest in the Austro-Hungarian Empire after Vienna and Budapest, was not just an administrative center. It was the heart of the economic, cultural, and political life of the entire region. Wide boulevards, majestic Art Nouveau and Neo-Renaissance architecture, an opera house, a university, numerous banks, and trading houses created the image of a European metropolis where Eastern and Western traditions intertwined. The railway hub connected Lviv with Vienna, Krakow, Budapest, and Chernivtsi, transforming the city into a crucial transportation center in the eastern part of the Habsburg Empire. It was here that the threads of trade routes connecting Central Europe with the Russian Empire converged. The strategic position of the city was determined not only by its infrastructure, but also by its geographical location on the watershed between the Baltic and Black Sea basins. Control over Lviv opened the way to the Carpathian passes and the Hungarian plain. Whoever controlled the city held the key to the gates of Central Europe. Lviv's ethnic mosaic made its political situation even more complex. Polish intelligentsia and landowners, Jewish merchants and artisans, Ukrainian peasantry from the surrounding areas, German and Austrian officials. All these groups had their own interests and aspirations. For Poles, Lviv was a symbol of their historical heritage and national identity. For Ukrainians, a center of cultural revival and national self-awareness. For Austrian authorities, an outpost of the empire in the east. For the Russian command, a strategic objective, the capture of which meant breaking through enemy defensive lines and opening the way deep into Austria-Hungary. In the military plans of all sides, Lviv occupied a special place. The Austrian command considered the city a key point in the defense of the empire's eastern borders. Fortifications were built, and a system of strongholds capable of withstanding a prolonged siege was created. The Russian command saw in the capture of Lviv not only a strategic, but also a symbolic success: the return of ancient Russian lands under the scepter of the Romanovs. Polish military formations were preparing to defend the city as part of their historical heritage, hoping that this struggle would hasten the revival of an independent Polish state. On the eve of military actions, an atmosphere of tense anticipation reigned in the city. Shops were filled with people stocking up on provisions. Banks were besieged by depositors seeking to withdraw their savings. Refugees crowded the train station, trying to leave for safer places. At the same time, life continued to buzz in Lviv's cafes and restaurants, as if no one wanted to believe in the inevitability of the impending catastrophe. By the summer of 1914, a tense military situation had developed on the approaches to Lviv. The Russian Imperial Army had moved imposing forces to the borders of Galicia. 3 armies totaling over 350,000 bayonets and sabers. The core of the strike group consisted of infantry divisions, reinforced by artillery brigades with the newest 3-inch quick-firing guns, cavalry units, dragoons, uhlans, and Cossacks provided mobility and reconnaissance. Command was exercised by General Nikolai Ivanov, an experienced military leader who had served in the Russo-Japanese campaign. His tactical doctrine was based on the massive use of artillery followed by frontal infantry attacks. Russian troops were characterized by high morale and steadfastness in defense, but suffered from a lack of modern communication and coordination between units. The Austro-Hungarian army countered the advancing Russian troops with about 280,000 soldiers under the command of General Konrad von Hötzendorf. Austrian units were superbly equipped. The newest Mannlicher rifles, Schwarzlose machine guns, powerful field artillery. A peculiarity of the Austrian army was its multinational character. Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, and Rusyns fought in the ranks of Lviv's defenders. This created certain problems with coordination and language barriers, but at the same time provided a deep knowledge of the terrain and conditions. The tactical doctrine of the Austrians relied on maneuverability, the use of fortified positions, and counterattacks on the flank of the advancing enemy. A special role in the defense of Lviv was played by Polish volunteer formations, legions under the command of Józef Pilsudski, numbering about 25,000 fighters. These units were characterized by high morale and motivation. They fought not just for the Habsburg Empire, but for a future independent Poland. The legionaries were armed primarily with Austrian weapons, but used flexible partisan tactics based on deep knowledge of the terrain and popular support. The strategic plans of the sides differed significantly. The Russian command viewed the capture of Lviv as a key step towards the defeat of the entire Austro-Hungarian army and an advance towards the Carpathians. It was planned to encircle the city from the north and south, cutting off communications and forcing the garrison to surrender. The Austrians, on the contrary, planned an active defense based on the system of fortifications around the city and prepared reserves for counterattacks on the flanks of the advancing Russian troops. Polish formations were to provide reconnaissance and sabotage operations in the enemy's rear. Expectations for the upcoming battle were contradictory. The Russian command was confident of rapid success, counting on numerical superiority and high troop morale. The Austrian leadership prepared for a long defense, hoping to wear down the enemy and await reinforcements from the Western Front. Polish legionaries saw the battle for Lviv as the first step towards the revival of independent Poland. No one assumed that the battle would turn into a protracted, bloody drama that would forever change the fate of the city and the entire region. In August 1914, the Russian army launched a decisive offensive on Lwów. At dawn on August 3rd, forward units of the 8th Army Corps under General Brusilov crossed the border of Austria-Hungary and rapidly advanced towards the Galician capital. Russian artillery opened massive fire on the advanced Austrian fortifications, creating a curtain of fire for the advancing infantry. The roar of hundreds of cannons echoed for tens of kilometers, instilling terror in the hearts of defenders and civilians. The tactical plan of the Russian command was simple and effective. The main strike was delivered from the northeast, while auxiliary forces tied down Austrian reserves in the southern direction. Infantry regiments, formed into classical battalion columns, relentlessly advanced despite the heavy fire of the defenders. Cossack reconnaissance patrols played a special role in the offensive, infiltrating the enemy's rear, disrupting communications, and sowing panic. The Austrian command proved unprepared for such a large-scale and rapid offensive. The advanced fortifications, whose creation had taken years of preparation, fell within the first 2 days of fighting. A particularly difficult situation developed in the area of Zolochiv, where Russian infantry broke through the defenses and rushed towards the suburbs of Lviv. The local population met the advance of Russian troops with mixed feelings. Polish and Ukrainian intelligentsia mostly supported Austria, fearing Russification. The peasantry, however, especially in the eastern regions, often welcomed Russian soldiers as liberators. In Lviv itself, panic began. Wealthy citizens hastily left the city, taking valuables, while Austrian authorities frantically fortified the city's outskirts. On August 5th, a decisive battle took place near Busk, where the main forces of both sides clashed. Russian infantry, supported by artillery, crashed against Austrian positions. The battle continued all day, turning into hand-to-hand combat. By evening, the Austrians were forced to retreat, having lost more than 5,000 killed and wounded. Russian losses were also significant, but the strategic initiative firmly passed into their hands. On August 6th, forward units of the Russian army reached the eastern outskirts of Lviv. The city lay before them, majestic and hushed in anticipation of the inevitable battle. The Austrian garrison, reinforced by Polish legionaries, took up a circular defense, turning every house into a fortress. A new phase of the battle began, the struggle for urban blocks, where numerical and artillery superiority no longer played a decisive role. The defense of Lviv presented an astonishing example of military cooperation between various ethnic groups under a unified command. The Austro-Hungarian garrison, numbering approximately 25,000 soldiers, was reinforced by Polish volunteer formations, totaling up to 8,000 men. The defense was commanded by General Rudolf Steger-Steiner, an experienced officer who had served in the Imperial Army for over 30 years. The city's fortifications in Lviv were organized on a concentric principle. The outer belt consisted of a system of forts located on the commanding heights around the city. Particularly strong were the fortifications on High Castle and the Citadel, from which all approaches to the city were visible. The second defense belt ran along the line of the city outskirts, where barricades, machine gun nests, and artillery positions were constructed. Finally, the central part of the city was prepared for street fighting. Embrasures were made in houses, basements were converted into shelters, and intersections were blocked by anti-tank barriers. The defense tactics were based on the principle of deeply echeloned resistance. Forward units were to slow the enemy's advance, inflicting maximum casualties, and then withdraw to main positions. Artillery was positioned to provide crossfire across all probable directions of attack. Mobile reserves, mainly cavalry units, were prepared for counterattacks on the flanks of a breakthrough enemy. Interaction between the various ethnic units of the defenders was surprisingly effective, despite language barriers and cultural differences. Austrian officers commanded Hungarian, Czech, Slovak, and Polish soldiers. A system of conventional signals and specially trained liaisons, fluent in several languages, was used for coordination. Polish volunteer formations held a special place in the defense system. Pilsudski's legionaries, well acquainted with the terrain and enjoying the support of the local population, performed reconnaissance functions and organized sabotage operations in the rear of the advancing Russian troops. Additionally, they controlled key urban infrastructure facilities, the railway station, bridges, water supply, and power plant. The civilian population actively participated in defense activities. Thousands of Lviv residents, Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, came out to construct fortifications. Women organized field hospitals and feeding stations for soldiers. University students formed volunteer self-defense squads that patrolled the streets and helped maintain order. City authorities mobilized all resources to support the military effort: food warehouses, transport, medicines. August 6, 1914, became the day when the tactical confrontation for Lviv reached its climax. Russian troops, inspired by initial successes, launched a series of coordinated attacks on the northeastern outskirts of the city. General Brusilov, commanding this sector, employed an innovative tactic of wave attacks, where one line of infantry replaced another, giving the defenders no respite. The Austrian command responded with masterfully organized counterattacks. Particularly effective was the maneuver of Colonel Franz Kuchera, when 3 battalions of Hungarian infantry, covertly transferred through the city park, suddenly struck the flank of the advancing Russian units. Within 3 hours of bloody combat, the Russian offensive in this sector was halted. Polish legionaries under the command of Captain Rydz Śmigły carried out a daring sortie into the rear of the Russian troops, destroying an artillery battery and sowing panic among reserve units. Natural conditions also played a significant role in the development of the tactical confrontation. Torrential rains, which began on August 7th, turned the roads around Lviv into impassable mudflows. Heavy Russian artillery got stuck in the soggy soil, significantly reducing the firepower of the attackers. The Austrians skillfully used this situation, transferring light mountain guns along paved city streets and concentrating fire on vulnerable areas. The hilly terrain around Lviv became another factor determining the nature of the hostilities. High Castle and the Citadel, dominating the city, became key defensive points. Austrian observers, located on these heights, adjusted artillery fire with astonishing accuracy. Russian commanders were forced to seek Raudau-Ersching, which slowed down the advance and increased losses. On August 10th, the Russian command made a decisive attempt to break through the city's defenses from the south. 3 infantry divisions, supported by Cossack cavalry, attacked Austrian positions in the Lychakiv cemetery area. A fierce battle ensued, during which both sides displayed exceptional courage and tactical skill. The Austrians used an effective system of echeloned defense, where each line of trenches was covered by cross-machine gun fire. Russian troops, suffering heavy losses, continued to methodically advance, using underbarrel grenade launchers to suppress enemy firing points. While gunfire and shells roared outside the walls of Lviv, an equally dramatic struggle unfolded within the besieged city, a struggle for survival. From the first days of the siege, residents faced a severe shortage of the most basic necessities. Food supplies dwindled at an alarming rate. Bread, that staple food, was rationed, no more than 200 grams per person per day. Queues for it formed from early morning and stretched for several blocks. Maria Dembitskaya, a teacher at the city gymnasium, recorded in her diary, "Today I spent 4 hours in line for bread. I received a stale loaf that I will have to stretch for 3 days. My neighbor shares recipes for bran flatbreads and potato peelings. I never thought I would be happy about such things." Families with children and the elderly suffered particularly hard. Milk became an unattainable luxury, and fresh vegetables and fruits disappeared from the shelves in the very first week of the siege. City dwellers began to set up gardens right in city squares and parks. Every scrap of land was used to grow potatoes, beets, and cabbage. The problem with medical care was no less acute. City hospitals were overflowing with wounded soldiers. Only corridors and utility rooms remained for civilians. Medicines were dispensed in minimal doses, and bandages had to be washed and reused repeatedly. Dr. Stanislav Kowalski recalled, We operated by candlelight when kerosene for lamps ran out. Anesthesia only for the most severe cases. People stoically endured the pain, understanding that morphine needed to be conserved. Nurses collapsed from exhaustion but continued to work. Water became another scarce resource. After the water supply was damaged by artillery shelling, residents were forced to use wells and collect rainwater. For drinking, it had to be boiled, and for washing and hygiene, every drop had to be saved. Despite all the hardships, Lviv residents showed amazing resilience and mutual assistance. A whole system of mutual aid emerged. Those who had some supplies shared with neighbors. Elderly women looked after children whose parents worked in hospitals or helped strengthen the defenses. Students organized volunteer patrols to deliver water to homes where disabled people and the elderly lived. Relations between the civilian population and the military developed differently. Austrian and Polish soldiers, for the most part, treated city dwellers with understanding and sympathy, often sharing their rations with children. However, as the siege tightened and losses grew, nerves began to fray for everyone. Cases of requisitions and conflicts became more frequent. When Russian troops entered the city, many residents met them with mixed feelings. Some saw them as occupiers, others as liberators. The Russian command sought to establish supplies for the city and restore normal life. But military realities often thwarted these intentions. August 8, 1914 went down in the history of Lviv as the day of a decisive turning point. At dawn, the Russian army launched a massive attack on the northern suburbs of the city. 3 infantry divisions, supported by heavy artillery, struck Austrian fortifications in the Zholkievsky suburb. The ground trembled from exploding shells, and the sky was shrouded in smoke from fires. The Austrian garrison, exhausted by previous battles, began to retreat, leaving street after street. It seemed the fall of the city was inevitable. At this critical moment, Colonel Stanislaw Septitsky, commander of the Polish Legion, made a risky decision. Gathering all reserves, about 2,000 fighters, he launched a sudden flanking attack on the advancing Russian units. The legionnaires attacked with the fury of the doomed, breaking into the enemy's ranks and engaging in hand-to-hand combat. The Russian offensive faltered. By noon, the initiative had completely passed to the city's defenders. Septitsky's counterattack entered military textbooks as a classic example of tactical mastery in urban warfare. No less dramatic events unfolded in the southern direction. Here, Russian troops under the command of General Radko Dmitriev tried to break through to the city's center via the Lychakivsky suburb. The old cemetery became a key defensive point, where Hungarian Honveds took up positions. A fierce battle unfolded among the graves and crypts. The Hungarians, sheltering behind stone tombstones, met the Russian infantry with a barrage of fire. 3 times Russian soldiers rose to attack, and 3 times they retreated, leaving dead and wounded. By evening, the cemetery resembled hell. The ground was riddled with craters, marble angels lay broken, and the air was filled with the moans of the wounded. On August 10th, an event occurred that became a turning point in the city's fate. Russian artillery concentrated fire on the water tower, a strategic object that provided Lviv with water. After hours of shelling, the tower collapsed, depriving the city of drinking water. The position of the defenders became critical. The Austrian command was forced to make a difficult decision: to abandon Lviv to preserve the army's combat effectiveness. On the night of August 11th, an organized withdrawal of troops began. Rearguard units, consisting mainly of Polish legionnaires, held back the enemy's advance, allowing the main forces to retreat to pre-prepared positions. On August 12th, Russian troops solemnly entered Lviv, abandoned by its defenders. The city was taken, but the price of this victory turned out to be exorbitantly high for all participants in the drama. While the fate of Lviv was being decided on the battlefields, a no less fierce battle, a diplomatic one, unfolded in the cabinets of European capitals. The great powers closely followed the developments in Galicia, understanding the strategic importance of this region for the future map of Europe. Russian diplomacy presented the offensive on Lviv as a liberation mission, the return of ancient Russian lands. Official notes sent to neutral states emphasized Galicia's historical connection with Kievan Rus and the protection of the Slavic population from Austrian oppression. Foreign Minister Sazonov personally oversaw the information campaign, striving to secure international support for the actions of the Russian army. The Austro-Hungarian Empire deployed its entire diplomatic arsenal to present the Russian offensive as an act of overt aggression. Viennese newspapers were filled with headlines about Cossack atrocities and the suffering of the civilian population. Special efforts were directed at attracting the sympathies of neutral countries, primarily the United States of America. To this end, a special delegation was sent to Washington, which met with congressmen and influential industrialists. Germany, as Austria-Hungary's main ally, provided strong diplomatic support. Berlin used the Battle for Lviv in its propaganda, portraying Russia as a barbaric Asian power threatening European civilization. German diplomats actively worked in Scandinavian countries, seeking to create an anti-Russian bloc in Northern Europe. France and Great Britain, Russia's allies in the Entente, found themselves in a difficult position. On the one hand, they publicly expressed support for the Russian offensive, but on the other, they feared an excessive strengthening of Russia in Central Europe. The French press enthusiastically wrote about the victories of Russian arms, but diplomats in private conversations expressed concern about the fate of the Polish population of Galicia. London strategists were already thinking about the post-war arrangement of Europe, seeing an independent Poland as a counterbalance to both German and Russian influence. The European press of that time turned into a real battlefield. Newspapers from all countries published contradictory reports from the front, dramatic eyewitness accounts, and analytical articles by experts. Swiss and Swedish publications, which had correspondents on both sides of the front, especially actively covered the Lviv events. Their reports, often contradicting the official propaganda of the warring parties, created a more objective picture of what was happening. The diplomatic struggle had a direct impact on the course of military operations. Fearing international condemnation, the Russian command issued orders to avoid artillery shelling of Lviv's historic center and cultural monuments. Austrian authorities, in turn, sought to portray themselves as defenders of European values, evacuating museum collections and providing assistance to the civilian population under the gaze of foreign journalists' cameras. Behind every battle are people, not just figures on a tactical map, but individuals with their own destinies, dreams, and fears. The Battle for Lviv gathered thousands of such stories under its banners. Second Lieutenant Kazimierz Sosnkowski, a 22-year-old graduate of the Krakow Military Academy, commanded a company of Polish legionaries. In his letters to his fiancée Maria, he wrote, "Every morning I look at the photograph of our unfinished house. It gives me strength when I have to lead men into attack." Kazimierz survived the battle but lost his right arm. After the war, he still married Maria and became a famous architect, designing buildings that could be drawn with his left hand. A different fate awaited the Russian lieutenant Alexei Brusilov, nephew of the famous general. In a diary found with his body, the last entry read, "Today I dreamed of my childhood home in Tver. The apple trees were blooming. It's strange to think that they will bloom even without me. He died during the assault on the Lychakiv suburb, 3 days before his 20th birthday. Among the defenders of the city, Dr. Tadeusz Rydzewski, chief surgeon of the city hospital, distinguished himself with particular bravery. In the midst of artillery shelling, he performed a complex operation on a wounded child, not stopping his work even when a fragment shattered the operating room window. His assistant, nurse Sofia Galitskaya, recalled, "The doctor worked so calmly, as if he were in a peaceful clinic in Vienna." When I asked if he was afraid, he replied, "Fear is a luxury that a doctor cannot afford." Ordinary citizens also showed extraordinary courage. 70-year-old teacher Anna Wojciechowska organized a school for children in the basement of her house, continuing lessons even during the fiercest battles. "History and math should not stop because of war," she told parents who doubted the safety of such lessons. The moral dilemmas faced by participants in the battle often proved more complex than tactical decisions. Austrian Lieutenant Franz Huber wrote in his memoirs, "The hardest part was giving the order to requisition food from civilians. I saw the hungry eyes of children and understood that I was taking their last. But my soldiers also had to eat to protect these same children." Russian ensign Nikolai Gumilyov, a future famous poet, admitted in a letter to Anna Akhmatova, "Yesterday we captured an Austrian officer. He showed a photograph of his wife and newborn son. I gave him my chocolate and tobacco. My soldiers looked on with understanding. In such moments, war becomes especially senseless." The letters and diaries of the battle's participants reveal the deep psychological impact of the struggle. Many noted a strange feeling of unreality, where the beauty of the ancient city contrasted with the horrors of war. Others wrote about sudden moments of humanity amidst the chaos, about temporary truces to collect the wounded, about exchanging cigarettes between trenches, about the joint efforts of opponents to save cultural values. By mid-August 1914, it became evident that the Battle for Lviv was approaching its tragic finale. After 12 days of fierce fighting, the Austro-Hungarian command made the agonizing decision to abandon the city. On the night of August 13th, the last units of defenders left Lviv, blowing up bridges and warehouses with military supplies behind them. In the morning, Russian troops entered the deserted streets. The price of this victory proved exorbitantly high for all participants in the drama. The Russian army lost over 35,000 soldiers and officers killed and wounded. Losses among officers were particularly heavy. Up to 40% of company and battalion commanders were out of action. Austro-Hungarian losses amounted to about 28,000 men, including prisoners. Polish legions lost almost a third of their strength. Material losses were also enormous. The Russian army lost 82 guns, over 200 machine guns, and a significant amount of transport. The Austrians were forced to abandon almost all heavy artillery, being unable to evacuate it along the destroyed roads. The city suffered severely from artillery shelling. The railway station, water tower, and many residential areas were destroyed. The strategic consequences of the battle proved ambiguous. For Russia, the capture of Lviv was the greatest success of the initial period of the war. Russian troops advanced deep into Austro-Hungarian territory, posing a threat to the Carpathian passes and the Hungarian plain. The moral effect of the victory was immense. Church bells rang in Petrograd, and newspapers printed enthusiastic reports about the return of the ancient Russian city to the bosom of the empire. For Austria-Hungary, the loss of Lviv was a heavy blow, jeopardizing the entire eastern border. The Viennese command was forced to urgently transfer reserves from the Serbian and Italian fronts, weakening their positions there. The political effect of the defeat was no less devastating. The empire's national minorities saw in it a sign of weakness of the central authority. For the Poles, the battle held special significance. Despite the defeat, the heroic defense of the city became a symbol of national revival. Pilsudski's legionaries proved that Poles were capable of fighting for their land, even without their own state. This battle laid the foundation for a future independent Poland. The political situation in the region changed dramatically. The Russian administration, established in Lviv, began a policy of Russification. Ukrainian schools were closed, Russian language instruction was introduced, and Orthodoxy received a privileged position. This provoked resistance from the local population, especially the Polish and Ukrainian intelligentsia. Military historians would later call the Battle of Lviv a classic example of urban warfare of the early 20th century, where traditional tactics clashed with the realities of modern warfare. This battle changed the fate of the city and the entire region, becoming one of the turning points of the First World War on the Eastern Front. In the Polish historical consciousness, the battle for Lviv occupies a special, almost sacred place. This battle became not just a military episode, but a symbol of national resilience and rebirth. When Poland gained independence in the interwar period, the events of those August days of the 14th year were elevated to the rank of a national myth. Lviv, which the Poles called Lemberg, transformed into a symbol city, a hero city whose defense entered history textbooks alongside the defense of Częstochowa from the Swedes in the 17th century. Polish historiography of the interwar period presented the battle as an exclusively Polish achievement, often downplaying the role of the Austrian command and other ethnic units. Popular books and articles of that time emphasized that it was Polish legionnaires who became the soul of the resistance, and their commander, Józef Pilsudski, a national hero. Fiction of the 20s and 30s actively developed the Lviv theme. Stefan Żeromski's novel contained poignant scenes of the city's defense, where the author masterfully conveyed the atmosphere of heroism and self-sacrifice. Julian Tuwim's poem, quote, "One," became a classic of Polish literature. Its lines were memorized by schoolchildren throughout the country. Visual arts also contributed to the memorialization of the battle. Wojciech Kosak's monumental painting, Defense of the Lviv Citadel, was exhibited in the National Museum in Warsaw, delighting visitors with its dynamism and emotional power. Sculptor Zawery Dunikowski created a series of bronze bas-reliefs depicting key moments of the battle, which adorned the building of the Ministry of War. After the Second World War, when Lviv became part of the Soviet Union and a communist regime was established in Poland itself, the official interpretation of the events of the 14th year underwent significant changes. Marxist historiography presented the battle as an imperialist adventure, in which the common people became victims of the ambitions of the ruling classes. Pilsudski's name, declared a fascist, was removed from textbooks, and the heroism of the legionnaires was explained by their class unconsciousness. However, in popular memory and unofficial culture, the Lviv epic continued to live. In family traditions, passed down from grandfathers to grandchildren, in songs sung at secret veteran meetings, in poems circulating in samizdat, everywhere the image of the heroic city and its defenders was preserved. After the fall of communism in '89, there was a real explosion of interest in the battle for Lviv. Memoirs of participants, previously forbidden historical studies, archival documents were published. Modern Polish historians strive for a more objective analysis of events, recognizing the contribution of all sides and avoiding nationalistic exaggerations. Nevertheless, in mass consciousness, the Lviv battle remains primarily Polish glory, a symbol of national spirit and resilience. Every year on the anniversary of the battle, a solemn ceremony takes place at the monument to the unknown soldier in Warsaw, with the participation of high-ranking state officials. School children write essays about the heroes of the defense, and tourist agencies organize special tours to the battle sites, despite the fact that the city is now outside Poland. The perceptions of the Battle of Lviv in Russian and Austro-Hungarian historical traditions reflected all the contradictions of imperial thinking in the early 20th century. For Tsarist Russia, the capture of Lviv became a triumphant return of primordially Russian lands to the bosom of the empire. Official reports from the Stavka, Supreme Command Headquarters, presented this victory as an act of historical justice and the liberation of the Slavic population from Austrian oppression. The newspaper Ruskoye Slovo wrote, "Ancient Lviv, founded by Prince Danilo Halitsky, is once again overshadowed by the double-headed eagle. Historical justice has triumphed." Military historians of the empire emphasized the strategic genius of the Russian command, particularly highlighting the role of General Brusilov. The Austro-Hungarian interpretation of events presented a completely different picture. Viennese newspapers wrote about temporary occupation and tactical retreat to preserve the army. Special attention was paid to the heroism of the city's defenders who fought against a numerically superior enemy. Official military reports emphasized the five of the Russian army, accusing it of deliberate shelling of civilian objects and cultural monuments. The collapse of both empires after World War I led to a radical transformation of historical narratives. In Soviet Russia, the Lviv operation was initially viewed as an example of, quote, "Six," where workers and peasants in soldiers' greatcoats became victims of Tsarist ambitions. However, from the 1930s, when Stalinist ideology began to rehabilitate certain aspects of the imperial past, the assessment of the battle changed. It was now presented as an example of the military art of the Russian army and proof of historical rights to Western Ukrainian lands. In post-Soviet Russian historiography, a dual approach is observed. On the one hand, errors of imperial policy and the ambiguity of Russification measures in Galicia are recognized. On the other hand, the battle for Lviv remains in the pantheon of glorious victories of Russian arms, especially in popular literature and media. In Austrian historical tradition, after the collapse of the Habsburg monarchy, the Battle of Lviv receded into the background, giving way to events more significant for national identity. Modern Austrian historians view these events primarily in the context of the general collapse of imperial policy and Vienna's inability to resolve the national question. Ideological factors had a huge impact on the interpretation of the battle. In Soviet historiography, the class approach demanded emphasizing the anti-popular essence of the war and the suffering of the working masses. Any mention of the national liberation nature of the struggle of Poles or Ukrainians was strictly censored. Austrian historiography of the interwar period, especially during the years of Austro-fascism, used the Lviv epic as an example of a glorious past and the necessity of strong central authority. In the post-Soviet period, the ideological pendulum swung in the opposite direction. Now, Russian studies emphasize Russia's cultural mission and the protection of the Orthodox population, while Austrian studies emphasize the civilizing role of the Habsburgs in Eastern Europe. Only in recent years have works appeared that seek to overcome ideological templates and present a multi-dimensional picture of events, taking into account the interests and suffering of all participants in the drama. The European view of the Battle of Lviv was shaped through the prism of the complex geopolitical interests of the Western powers. German military analysts, despite their allied relations with Austria-Hungary, assessed the battle with cold professionalism. A secret memorandum from the German General Staff noted, "The loss of Lviv demonstrates fundamental problems in the Austrian military organization, especially regarding the coordination of multinational units." Colonel Max Hoffmann, one of the architects of Germany's Eastern strategy, wrote in his diary, "The Lviv defeat was inevitable. The Austrians dispersed their forces, trying to hold too extensive a defensive line." At the same time, the German press, bowing to political demands, portrayed the battle as a temporary setback, after which a triumphant return would inevitably follow. The French view was characterized by duality. As allies of Russia, the French officially welcomed the capture of Lviv. The newspaper Le Figaro dedicated an enthusiastic editorial to the victory of Russian arms, calling it the first step towards the liberation of Slavic peoples from the German yoke. However, closed analytical reviews by the French General Staff contained entirely different assessments. General Joffre wrote to the Minister of War, "The Russian advance in Galicia, for all its tactical impressiveness, is strategically dangerous. It creates a salient vulnerable to counterattacks from the north and south." French military attachés, observing the hostilities, noted the archaic nature of Russian tactics and excessive losses during the assault on fortified positions. The British reaction was the most pragmatic. London viewed the Lviv operation through the prism of the overall strategic balance. The Times wrote, "The Russian success in Galicia will force the Central Powers to transfer significant forces from the Western Front, which will ease the situation for our armies in Flanders." At the same time, British analysts were already thinking about the post-war arrangement of the region. A Foreign Office memorandum noted, "Control over Lviv will be a key factor in determining the eastern borders of future Poland, the existence of which meets British interests as a counterbalance to German and Russian influence." More than a century later, the Battle of Lviv remains deeply etched in Europe's collective memory. This city, which endured the tragic confrontation of the Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Polish armies, has become a symbol of the complex and contradictory relationships between the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe. The memory of the battle continues to live on in various interpretations, reflecting not only historical facts, but also contemporary geopolitical interests. For modern Poland, Lviv remains a symbolic city, despite its current belonging to Ukraine. Polish society carefully preserves the memory of the heroism of the city's defenders, annually commemorating the anniversary of the battle with solemn ceremonies. In history textbooks, the battle is described as an example of national resilience, and the names of the commanders of the Polish legions are included in the pantheon of national heroes. The Ukrainian perspective on these events has undergone significant evolution. While in the Soviet period the Battle of Lviv was viewed primarily through the prism of class struggle, in independent Ukraine it became part of the national narrative of the struggle for self-determination. Modern Ukrainian historians emphasize the complex ethnic mosaic of Galicia at that time and strive to show the participation of the Ukrainian population in these events. In Russia, the attitude towards the Lviv operation has also changed depending on the political conjuncture. Today, Russian historians acknowledge the strategic miscalculations of the Tsarist command, but continue to emphasize the military skill of the generals and the courage of the soldiers. European powers use the memory of the battle as a tool in contemporary political discourses. For Germany, these events serve as a reminder of the danger of imperialistic ambitions and the need for peaceful coexistence among the peoples of Central Europe. French analysts often refer to the Battle of Lviv when discussing issues of European security and the stability of the EU's eastern borders. For Lviv itself and its inhabitants, the memory of those August days of 1914 has become an integral part of the city's identity. The city's multinational past, its position at the crossroads of cultures and civilizations, is reflected in museum exhibits, architecture, and even street names. The Battle of Lviv today is perceived not only as a military clash, but also as a symbol of the complex inter-ethnic relations that continue to define the political landscape of Central and Eastern Europe. Historians of all countries recognize that in this battle, there were no absolute victors or vanquished. There was only a common tragedy of peoples drawn into the maelstrom of the World War.